Hey there, welcome. Glad you could join us. I'm your co-host, Dana Boss, here with my fellow traveler, Rose Schooler. And this is our podcast, Lead Up. It focuses on the intersection of leadership and management with real life. Managing a team and leading a group can be lonely and quite demanding at times. And we see you and we celebrate you. So come hang by the virtual water cooler with two very different perspectives on this topic. And welcome to Lead Up. Hello again. Back for another fun episode. And before we share the topic, I found this quote, Rose, that I think really summarizes my leadership and management little phrase that I love. And I'm curious what you think about it.
I'm nervous.
It's
I'm nervous.
No, don't worry. It's not a particularly
This isn't going to be Stump the Chump?
No, it is
Okay.
not. And by the way, this is by Jim Collins, who is that guy.
I love Good to Great.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
You know, I'm not a big business book reader, as many people know, but I love Good to Great.
Yep, exactly. He's done a ton, but he also wrote another book called Built to Last, which I think would be interesting to read. It's about companies that have really thrived over decades. And I'm curious about it. But anyway, here, I found this quote. Companies, and I'm actually going to put out their organizations.
Okay.
Because you're not always necessarily trying to make a profit for shareholders. But anyway, companies or organizations rarely fail for lack of vision. They fail because they cannot translate vision into execution. Vision without execution is hallucination. Great performance is about 1% vision and 99% alignment. What do you think?
Strategy without execution is PowerPoint.
Yes, that's why I wanted to share with you.
I love it because it not only requires the vision, but it requires, like Colin said in his quote, which is, you got to get the people behind you working on the same thing that you want to accomplish so you can execute.
Right.
Period.
Right.
Love it. Okay, so Dana Boss.
Yes.
Now that we're a few episodes in, as you know, we've been asking our listeners for topics that they would like us to cover. And we've gotten some really great feedback and some super interesting topics. The one that we're going to tackle today is a juicy one.
Okay.
And here you go.
Okay.
So I'm going to kick this off to you.
Okay.
Does a leader who embraces being kind and vulnerable get perceived as weak? Good one, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one that a boatload of people wonder even if they don't have the guts to ask it. There's a very direct answer to that, which is no. It does not create a perception of weakness. And there's scads of research that indicate that showing vulnerability and kindness makes your team more effective. In fact, Rose, this really relates to your head, heart, hands. This really relates to the heart piece. And there's a few things we've got to say. There's a few caveats to this, but in general, no, it does not set you up to be perceived as weak. But I do think we should first define what we mean by vulnerable.
Yeah, let's do a speed dating round on that. Throw out some words from your lens on what vulnerable means.
By the way, side note, this is one of those vague words that can mean many different things to many different people. And vague words get you into trouble because you think you're talking about the same thing and you're not, which is why I want to baseline our listeners for this. Well, I can tell you what it doesn't mean, which is it doesn't mean it's okay to just be unprepared and not know the fundamentals of your function or your business, right? Like you've got to have your foundation and be clear on it. And I'm sure, Rose, if someone had asked you, are you on track to meet your revenue target this year? And you were like, oh, God, I'm just not sure.
I'm not sure, but I'll tell you, the way you asked it was super kind. And it's not going to fly. It's not going to fly.
Right. So being vulnerable or acknowledging when you don't have all the answers or when you've made a mistake is not weakness, assuming that you are foundationally a prepared and competent person in your role.
The summary of that is, let's assume for this conversation that you have a baseline of knowledge, competency, and performance that you're building off of.
Yeah. And so if you're building off that, then vulnerability and being kind is simply showing that you're human and that you can make mistakes and you understand your folks can make mistakes. It shows that you might not have every answer in every moment, and that it's fine if your staff doesn't either. A huge piece of acknowledgement and kindness is being willing to acknowledge when you weren't your best self in a situation, and perhaps making it right. And that might even mean an apology. So that's what I think of, Rose, when someone says, is being kind and or showing vulnerability making you weak or strong? That's how I'm defining it. And I think it makes you stronger and it makes your team stronger. What do you think?
So let me look at a 3x3. I'm going to look at.
Oh, yeah. That business matrix.
Sorry. It's usually a 2x2, but I've got this 3x3 table in my head.
It ain't a real concept if it's not in a matrix.
Yeah, I know. So sorry. I'm looking at the top part of it being the audience, whether it's your peers, your managers, or your subordinates.
So I'm so glad you brought that up, because everything I'm talking about is in terms of a manager and a leader relating to their direct reports. Peers and your boss are a whole other ball of wax. We'll talk about that later.
Let's hit that though.
Yeah, we will. Let's talk about it.
Let's make sure we cover all three audiences.
Yeah.
And then I see the environment that you create and that the approach that you have with people as being two, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let me just hit those first two, which is you want to create an environment that's psychologically safe for all of those audiences, right? And you want to create a culture where everybody brings their best self to work. And then you also want to create, and maybe there's only 3x2, maybe the second and the third one are too much alike. I'm not going to split hairs on this. But you also want to create enough diversity and opinion across those audiences that you get a lot of different opinions and insights. So for me, vulnerability is all of those attributes and making sure you do so in a very transparent, humble, honest way.
Yeah, exactly. And again, scads of research that shows that increases the level of engagement and productivity of your team. And just so, because we always want to keep it real in these. First of all, I don't know, Rose, if this is going to throw you off, but I just want to say, I'm not perfect. And I just should put that out there.
Oh, Dana, I would love to be perfect in every way. And I have, throughout my career, reinforced the very vulnerable fact that I am far from it.
Yes. And I will say, and this is embarrassing for me to put forth since this is what I do for a living, but I can say there were times when I was interacting with my direct reports that I may have been impatient and may have snapped a little bit. Now, by snapped, I don't mean lose my mind. I mean, just be like short with them and a little snappish. I feel confident. If you talk to anyone who worked for me, they would say that was not typical of me, but that it could happen. And I was really fortunate that I had the level of trust and confidence on my team that I can remember two different instances where an employee called me on it, one-on-one. Like, can I talk to you about that meeting just now? And I mean, more power to them. They called me on it. And again, speaking of making your choices, how you're going to show up, I knew what they were saying was right. And I just had to apologize. Like it was the only thing that was the right thing to do. And I don't think that made me weaker.
So your example is again with your employees or your subordinates. And
yeah.
I honestly, and again, this is in the framework of there's competency, there's foundational knowledge.
Right.
Having said that, I can't think of a scenario as a leader where you shouldn't be kind and you shouldn't show vulnerability. That doesn't mean, again, we're going to say this over and over again, don't confuse those two attributes with being a softie.
Yeah.
Don't confuse those attributes with not setting aggressive, high expectations.
Yes.
You can set an expectation and you can do it in a way that's kind. In my example, I was trying to be a phenomenal leader because that's what I tried to do every day. And like I said, I failed often. And this one was like one of those exact scenarios where in an effort to be inclusive, I was anything but. So there was a new person that was joining a staff discussion. He's just a great dude. He was competent. He was an outstanding contributor. And I was just trying to make him feel comfortable. And I gave him a nickname. And I made the comment of, you know what? You're in when you have a nickname. right? And in an effort to make him feel really good, I really ostracized every single other person in that meeting that did not have a nickname. And thank God for this lovely woman on my team who pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Rose, you really kind of blew that one. You made everybody else feel really crappy by trying to make him feel good." So what do you do with it?
Right.
So what's the vulnerability part of this story? I've used it time and time again as an example of what a vulnerable leader will do when they realize they screw up
Mm-hmm.
with their subordinates. But then there's also a scenario, and again, who's your audience where you're working with your peer group?
Yeah. Okay. So let's shift now, because when I said there are a few caveats,
Yeah.
one is that you do have to think about how you show up with these different audiences, because the dynamics could be quite different. They might not be, but they might. So go ahead, Rose.
Yeah. So if I go to your peer group, I remember a very specific situation. I was in my boss's staff meeting, and similar to your example, Dana, I just kind of lost it. In snap, it was probably not a strong enough word. I was kind of rude and mean. Let's just call it like it is. I was rude and mean to a peer, and I knew it.
Yeah.
And no one had to call me on it.
Yeah.
I knew it. The conversation went on for about another 2 minutes. I had stopped talking.
Like, meaning you had stopped talking.
The staff conversation had moved on. And I literally said, hey, we got to take a pause. We got to take a pause. And everybody's like, "Schooler, what are you doing?
Right.
We're in the middle of a conversation."
You've already been a nightmare. You're starting it again.
I know. And I said, "Hey, I got to take a minute because my behavior was unacceptable. I would like to apologize to this person, and I'd like to do it in front of this staff, because this is not the culture, nor the tone, nor the type of relationships that I think we want to create in this organization. And I screwed up, and I'm really sorry. We can move on." And everybody, like, nobody's really said anything, but my IMs lit up.
Ah.
And it was like, wow. Yeah, instant messages, chat, whatever. They were like, "Hey, thanks for realizing you screwed up, being vulnerable, apologizing, and setting the right tone for how this team needs to operate together." So we talked about vulnerability and kindness with your employees. I think it has a lot of positivity to create a team environment within your peer group.
It's so funny. I can imagine doing a workshop on this. And I always start with ground rules, like, let's keep it real. If I'm saying something that is not realistic and practical, you've got to call me on it. And I can remember this one guy in particular. It wasn't about this topic, but he was like, shot his hand up. He's like, "Excuse me, you told us to keep it real." And I was like, "Yes, I did. So tell me." So I think we have to acknowledge that there are cultures where being kind and showing vulnerability in the ways we're talking, like I made a mistake or I could have handled that differently, is perceived as weak. There are macho or toxic cultures or whatever you want that are out there. I hate it, but it's true. And I can say I've worked in a couple of those, maybe not the worst toxic environment ever, but I know that the team meetings I was in as a peer, it was a different deal, but I didn't let it affect how I led my own team.
I think you're spot on, because let's look at this from a leadership and management perspective. It's your organization in that example. And do you want to create an organization that allows your employees, your subordinates, to exist in a culture and create a culture that allows them to thrive? Or do you want to create a culture that allows them to exist and survive?
Right.
And at the end of the day, the organization is the best benchmark and execution's the ultimate judge.
Yes, I so love that phrase.
Do you want to create followership or fear?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want compliance or commitment?
Mm-hmm.
All of these things come into that discussion.
And they do. And I can just say, like, I worked in an organization that at the senior level was not role modeling any of the stuff we're talking about. And so what I knew, though, was I'm not going to let that be the tone in my group. And I also spent a little time occasionally shielding them from some of the like toxic stuff that was going on. But I also knew that I had to understand the dynamics of the situation. I'm never going to be a jerk. So the kindness was there. In terms of quote unquote showing weakness, I knew perfectly well there were times where that wasn't going to serve me. I also want to say that I have had managers where I can absolutely not show any vulnerability. And again, I'm not recommending that, but it's the truth. I mean, I remember I had this one manager that I shared a little uncertainty with. Like there was this program I was designing and I could have gone a couple ways and I just wanted to throw ideas around. And I'm like, well, I don't know. It could be this way or it could be that way. I don't know. What do you think? And he gave me a humiliating response. He said, well, it sounds to me like you're not clear on your strategy. I wasn't humiliated, to be clear. I was like, wow, what a jerk. But that kind of comment is designed to make someone feel bad, right? I navigated around that. I was like, okay, clearly I've got to show up with him. Like, great, everything's on track. Everything's doing great. Obviously, the proof needs to be in the pudding in terms of execution. But this wasn't a person that I was going to be able to share things that like I was uncertain about. No way. I just want us to keep it real, that we all have to figure out the dynamics at play. Certainly as managers and leaders of our own teams, we can have a huge impact.
You're spot on. I think as a leader, you create the environment. As a peer, you influence the environment the best of your ability, and you can do that by role modeling the proper actions.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, Dana, if we're keeping it real, you can get in a situation where you're in a leadership environment that is toxic for you. And that could be different for different people and different reasons. We all appreciate different styles of leadership. And for some people, some can perceive something as very toxic. And I have always made the statement of do the best that you can to influence that in a positive direction. But if there's really no interest in change by your leader, and if it becomes psychologically unsafe for you, there are times where the only option is to leave.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is remove yourself from that situation.
Yeah, because life's just too short. Now, again, I know that's easier said than done sometimes. If you're supporting a family of 3 and et cetera, you can't just choose to leave your job. I do think it's important that all of us need to recognize when we're in an environment that's truly
toxic
and could be impacting our well-being.
Yeah. And again, I'm glad you challenged me on that a little bit, Dana, because my comment isn't that you walk in the next day and you slam your fist down and you quit, right?
Yeah,
You acknowledge that you're going to leave your door open. And if other opportunities present themselves, you're going to be much more open to pursuing them than you had in the past.
Yeah.
So, Dana, this was a fun discussion.
One last thing.
One last topic.
I also acknowledge I have heard different people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, genders talk about the question of vulnerability quite differently. I remember hearing once someone who was African-American man saying, sure, it's great to be vulnerable and kind and humble when you're the majority.
Yeah, and I think, your comment about if you're the minority in a room, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
It could be simply,
might not be,
you're the only woman in a room of men, which was often the case in tech. It could be that you're the only person of color in a room.
Yep.
Or it could be that you're the only man.
Yep.
At a woman's conference.
Yep.
The question of vulnerability, to your point, becomes much, much more difficult to manage. Yeah. But I do think some of the same considerations can apply.
They can.
It's just a much more difficult environment, acknowledged. Okay, with that, let's get into our hot take.
Hot
take. I think it's your job as a leader to create an environment for your teams where they can thrive versus survive.
Yeah, basically. And what do you want your legacy to be? Like, I'm hoping even those employees I snapped at, I think in general, they're going to say working for her was a positive impact on my life. It wasn't a nightmare that I had to get through.
Yeah.
And it's not just me that thinks. Again, there's plenty of research about this now. Go Google psychological safety and Amy Edmondson, and you'll see all kinds of research.
Brilliant. Her work is brilliant. Sorry, I had to give a shout out for Amy.
We'll do a specific episode on this. But anyway, acting like a human with a heart makes you more effective as a manager or a leader. And it makes your team more productive, more willing to take risks, to pitch an idea, whatever. Being a manager and a leader takes practice. We're not going to get it right every time. We're certainly not going to get it right out of the box. And it's also a never-ending journey. Rose, you're a good example of this. I don't know anyone, for no matter how long they've managed or led, that they feel like they've mastered it. A new challenge comes up, we can bungle it. I just would want people to recognize that it's a journey. So let yourself be vulnerable and acknowledge when you could have done something differently and then grow from it.
I will close with, as a peer and a peer group, lead by example and create and demonstrate a culture of trust and collaboration within your peer group. And with that, we'd like to give a shout out to the person that submitted that question.
Yes, really rich question.
Yes, and please continue to submit other topics that you would like us to hit in the future. Thank you again.
Okay, good up. Let's wrap up with a quote that Rose found, which kind of sums up the points we're making in this episode. Here we go. To share your weakness is to make yourself vulnerable. To make yourself vulnerable is to show your strength. And that comes to you from a person named Chrissy Jamie. And we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you everyone for spending some of your really precious time with us today. Odds are you don't have a lot of it, and we super appreciate you listening. We'd love to hear from you. What are your questions or thoughts on the topic of management and leadership in real life? We promise if we hear from you, we will respond and we will discuss those topics and those questions on the podcast. So send us an email. You can find it on our podcast landing page. And until next time, cheers to all of you out there doing your best to deliver for your teams, your organizations, and yourselves.